Okay, thank you. Better late than never. So today I'm going to talk about the global carbon budget, actually a small part of it, and this was released last week. So it's some of you may have seen it. But I'm only going to talk about a small part of the global carbon project today, and hopefully put this morning's discussions in a bit of context. So first thing I want to talk about is fossil and cement emissions and where they've gone in the last years. I want to compare the current observed emissions with emission scenarios that are coming from the IPCC, and then put this in the context of climate negotiations. So first of all, fossil and cement emissions. I'm very surprised that no one has shown this figure today. This is the growth in global emissions in the last 20 years. 1990 to 2000, emissions grew at around about 1% per year. From 2000 onwards, they've grown at around about 3% per year, so 3 times greater. In 2011, we estimated emissions to grow at 3% per year. In terms of the long-term growth, you can see 2009, the global financial crisis had virtually no effect, a slight little dip, but nothing else. And then I need Al Gore's ladder here to go up to the red point up there. 2012, we estimate another 2.5% based on economic output estimates from the International Monetary Fund. So all in all, from comparing to 1990 up to 2012, emissions have grown about 60%. They're about 60% higher than they were in 1990, despite, 18 conference of the parties and so on. What's causing all this emissions growth? Over here we have global emissions in 2010, global emissions in 2011, and the coloured bars there is what's causing the growth. The orange bar there is China. It's responsible for about 80% of the growth in global emissions in 2011. To put that into context, Chinese emissions increased last year. The amount of emissions increased last year from China is about the same size as the emissions in Germany. It's actually a little bit bigger than the emissions in Germany. So China is adding a Germany every year in terms of emissions. This figure shows the top 4 global emitters. They're responsible for about 60% of global emissions. China, 10 years ago, was the 3rd biggest emitter, the orange line there. Now its emissions are growing at around 10% per year. It's now responsible for 1/4 of global emissions. And this 10% per year, it's not just last year, it's the year before and the year before and the year before. So all this talk about radical growth in renewable energies, wind power and so on in China, certainly not showing in the data in terms of emissions. Maybe the emissions are growing because they're building so many wind turbines, or maybe it's having a much smaller effect than people are thinking. China is also installing a lot of coal power plants. The USA had steady increase in emissions in the last 50 years or so. In the last 5 years, emissions have started to drop. This is partly due to the financial crisis. You can see a little dip there, but also this shift to from coal to gas that many people have heard about. The EU 27, if you extrapolate the EU countries back to 1960, they followed the US until about 1980, 1990, and then you see this sort of division, this sort of wedge between the US and EU. And before you start to get excited about successful EU climate policies, there's many other factors responsible for that. And you can see the bottom text there, what's the cause of this big difference in 2011 between the US and the EU? About 50% of that is because of Germany, the reunification of Germany around 1990. The UK is responsible for about 20%. This is the shift from coal to gas, not driven by climate policy, but driven by other factors. Romania, Czech Republic, Poland, these countries had sort of economic troubles. And this is partly what we're hearing about Doha last week, the hot air coming from Poland, for example. India, 4th biggest emitter, recently overtook Japan and Russia. Emissions growing 8% per year. Maybe it will continue to grow somewhat like China, we're yet to see. But India's rapidly changing as well. We always like to talk about per capita emissions and this sort of idea of fairness. This grey line in the middle there is the world average per capita emissions, about 1.4 tonnes of carbon per person. And I want to sort of focus on China. I'm not sure if I have a little China here, the orange line. It emits about 36% more on a per capita basis than the world average. China's per capita emissions are about the same as the EU per capita emissions. Probably 2012, 2013, China will emit more than the EU on a per capita basis. Of course, the US is much higher, India is much lower, but certainly when you're talking about China, you can't sort of not give them emission commitments because of their per capita emissions. They are very, very high. And I'll come back to this a bit later. Norway, 2.7 tonnes carbon per capita. EU is about 2. So Norway, of course, with all the hydropower, but still the oil and gas sector, Norway's emissions are very, very high per capita, given there's a lot of hydropower. And of course, Qatar, the meeting last week, around about 15 tonnes carbon per capita. It's I think the highest, if not close to the highest emitter per capita. These are Norway's emissions. These are the officially reported statistics to the Framework Convention. The orange line is CO2 emissions. They've grown around about 30% since 2010. Greenhouse gases, when you include methane, nitrous oxide, have grown about 8%. Of course, this is helped by what happened in the early 90s there. If you take 1992 as the base year, you'll get quite a different picture. This is where Norway has promised to go, assuming you take it in a straight line, 30% reduction of 1990 emissions by 2020. If you take the orange line there, CO2 emissions, it's around about a 50% reduction at 5% per year. I'll come back to this in a minute. If you take all greenhouse gases, around about 3.5% per year. These are not easy mitigation rates, particularly when emissions are still on an upward trend. Changing sort of to look at emission scenarios, the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has been associated with about 4 generations of emission scenarios. I show 3 here. I'll show a simplified version of this plot in a minute. Just want to make a couple of points here. Emissions, which is the black line here, constantly track the top end of emission scenarios for all generations of emission scenarios. And out of these scenarios, there's about 50 there. There's many hundreds or thousands behind that. But out of these 50, there's only one which is consistent with the 2-degree pathway, and that's the blue one, which you see drop down quite radically. So just simplifying that figure, I've picked out the 2 scenarios here from the latest set of scenarios coming from the IPCC. Observed emissions are the black line. The red line here is a sort of a business as usual type scenario. And you can see emissions are quite nicely following that business as usual scenario. And if we keep following it, 2100's around about 5 degrees plus or minus. If we want to get to this likely chance of staying below 2 degrees, which is the political language that's used, we have to follow this blue path. And I want to make 3 points about that. Is it possible to follow this blue path? Can we follow it? What are the risks with following it? So I'm going to look at the short term, the medium term, and the long term. In the short term, emissions need to peak globally and start to come down by about 2020. Jürgen has a great picture of this. His last slide is the ship going towards the storm, and it's a nice analogy. If you're in a ship powering ahead and you want to turn around, even if you put the engines in reverse, you'll keep going forward for some time. So there's a lot of inertia in the system. It's going to be very, very hard to get global emissions to peak by 2020 when you consider Chinese emissions growing at 10% per year, Indian emissions 8% per year, and so on. So that's the first challenge. Second challenge in the sort of medium term, let's say around 2050, is sustaining mitigation rates of about 3% per year globally. This is a global average. Some countries will have to reduce their emissions at a much higher rate than that. Other countries may increase their emissions a little bit. So 3% per year globally is very ambitious. It's around about the same rate that emissions are going up now. Long term, and I think this is the biggest question mark, you'll see this figure, the blue line goes off the scale here. That's negative emissions. So to reach a 2-degree target, most studies now show that you need to have negative emissions. We have to take carbon out of the atmosphere. What does that mean? Can we do it? So if you think of the problems we're having with Mulkstar, carbon capture and storage, more broadly in Europe and around the world, we just can't seem to figure this technology out. But we're sort of dependent on a carbon capture and technology sort of technology. We need to figure it out. We need to deploy it at very high rates, higher than any other technology or large technologies being deployed. So this is a real big question mark to getting below 2 degrees. Can we get to negative emissions in the future? a little positive note, can we reduce emissions? You can. Won't go too much into detail here. This shows 4 European countries, Belgium, France, Sweden. Around the oil shocks, they had a drop in oil consumption, some behavioural changes, technology changes, and at the same time, they took hold of a new technology, nuclear, which allowed them to expand their energy consumption without the emissions. So I don't want to say anything good or bad about nuclear, but this technology, in combination with the reduction in oil consumption, allowed mitigation rates of 4 to 5% per year for greater than 10-year periods. So these sorts of things are possible. The UK, the main story there is the coal to gas, same as what we're seeing in the US now. Climate negotiations. We often hear about this rich country, poor country divide, or Annex 1, non-Annex 1, Annex B, non-Annex B. I've used Annex B here. These are the countries with emission commitments. You see the red cross and the blue cross there. These are the average per capita emissions on the vertical axis and economic output per capita on the horizontal axis. And you see, on average, the rich countries, the Annex B countries, have higher emissions and economic activity. But the little circles there are individual countries. And when you start to look at the individual countries, you see it's certainly not the case that the Annex B countries are the richest. There's a lot of non-Annex B countries with higher emissions and higher economic output. And this sort of is a good representation of this artificial division in climate negotiations where we split the world into two. It's just a totally unreal. The split doesn't make any sense to me. Looking at these Annex B, non-Annex B countries, what's happened in the last 20 years, Annex B countries, the rich nations, have stabilised their emissions, a little bit of help with the financial crisis there. The poor countries, the non-Annex B countries, the emerging countries have increased their emissions, more than doubled them in the last 20 years. They've gone from about 1/3 of emissions in 1990 to around about 2/3 of emissions in 2010, 11, 12. The world in 2011 is entirely different to the world in 1990. And we really have to get out of this mindset of negotiating based on what the world looked like in 1990. And this figure is a representation of what happened in Doha and the success that we've had in the last 20 years, I guess. So the figure adds up to global emissions. The red part on the bottom, these are the countries, the Annex B countries with the emission commitments that agreed in Doha to have emission commitments again up to 2020. In 2011, they're responsible for 14% of global emissions. So after 20 years of negotiations, the best we can do is to cover 14% of global emissions. And all they're going to do is to reduce their emissions by 20%. So if you want to get to 2 degrees with this attitude, like, forget it, no chance. Looking at the blue countries, these are the countries like Russia, Japan, that are still a part of the Kyoto Protocol, but don't have emission commitments. Add them together, you come to 22%. So if they joined up in this Doha meeting, we would only be covering 22% of emissions. The orange there is the US and Canada, non-ratified and withdrawn from the Kyoto Protocol. They add up to make it around about 1/3 of global emissions. But again, you'll see that their emissions overall have stabilised. Emissions growth is all happening in the non-Annex B countries. I've been a bit picking on the non-Annex B countries, so I'll say something nice about them this time. Or maybe it's not nice, but a different perspective. This figure shows the transfer of emissions between countries via international trade. So to give you an example, if you look at China, these are the emissions occurring in China to produce products which are consumed in Europe, if you follow the arrow to Europe, in the US, in Japan, and so on. Of course, there's a big flow from Russia into Europe, and so on. If you look at this data in time series, you see that the emission reductions that have been made in the Kyoto Protocol are totally offset by the increases in imports from developing countries. So this offsets any gains we've made in the Kyoto Protocol. This is pretty much the last slide. A different way of slicing the pie. Of course, there's many ways to slice the pie. How are you going to share emissions? This just gives a different view on, if you like, equity or responsibility and so on. So here we have cumulative emissions going back to 1750, current emissions in 2010, consumption-based emissions in 2010, So the consumption-based emissions don't make a huge difference, although for some countries it makes a quite significant difference. GDP and population. So these are just different ways of slicing the pie. Of course, there's many different ways, and of course you don't need to do it in such a mathematical way. But it shows that China, for example, is due for some emission reductions, particularly considering that it's going to be the biggest player in the next 10, 20, 30 years. So I'll finish up there. If you're interested in more, there's a couple of papers which came out with this Global Carbon Project last week. And of course, if you follow the link down the bottom there, you'll find a presentation more expanded of this. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.